you lie down in the dark, in somewhere warm, monotonous, and silent, and if you lie still so that even the sensations you get from your own skin are reduced to a minimum, you'll soon be reintroduced to an aspect of your own existence which in the normal course of events is made inconspicuous by the vivid, interesting, and urgent world of sight and sound. Under these circumstances, a new object begins to shine in the firmament of my consciousness. It's my felt self. It's been there all along, just like the moon hanging in the sky on a summer's day. But the world of sight and sound is usually so vivid and so insistent that it more or less outshines this other world. It's not just a process of simple subtraction, though, one which leaves me with a residue of experience belonging to the same order as the ones I've just lost. What I'm left with is something very special, without which it's almost impossible to imagine how I would recognize or know my own personal existence. And it's here, in this image, and only here, that I experience, or would experience, some of the most important symptoms of illness. This is the place where pains happen. This is the home of nausea. This is where itches and pins and needles occur. This, then, is the place which feels ill. Here in the gloom, trying to remember my own shape, the outline which I imagine, or rather the one which I feel, is quite unlike the one which I see when I open my eyes and look in the mirror. For one thing, the image that I now feel is much vaguer than the one I see. In fact, lying quite still like this, without feeling my contours against the world's edges, it's quite hard to imagine where I end and the world begins. As soon as I move, though, as soon as I feel the weight of my own limbs and the natural resistance of the objects around me, the image of myself at once starts to become clearer. It's almost as if the felt image is called into existence by the sensations which are created by my own actions, rather like a brass rubbing. In the same way, actions like shaving may help to improve my appearance, but at the same time, they also help to re-establish my subjective contours. Even so, the image that you actually make for yourself has some rather strange proportions. As to say, certain parts feel much larger than they look. For instance, if you poke your tongue into a hole in one of your teeth, the cavity feels much larger than it looks when you actually inspect it in the mirror. In fact, the felt image of the self is rather like those hidden images which artists used to amuse themselves with in the Renaissance, the so-called anamorphic pictures. I suppose the most famous example of these is that rather strange object which hovers like a flying saucer in the foreground of Holbein's picture called The Ambassadors. Now, it's actually a splayed-out skull, and if you view it from the right angle, you can almost restore it to a recognizable version of itself. Well, now, from the end of the 16th century, artists became very skilled at making anamorphic transformations of this sort. Here's rather a famous one. Now, what you can see here are the barely recognizable features of a human face. It's all splayed out. But if you put this reflecting surface here, then the well-known features of Charles I spring into relief. I've got another one here, almost as nice. It's even more distorted, though. Now, it's very hard to recognize any particular face here, but once again, if you put the cylinder in position, then you can see the face of Charles I's son. Now, in some ways, these two images are counterparts of the felt image on the one hand and the visible self on the other. Here is the self that you can see in the mirror with the proper metrical proportions, and this splayed out image here is the felt self, the one which you know simply from lying in the dark. And yet, in spite of its peculiar proportions, this felt image is the one through which and by which we experience our physical presence in the world. In fact, this felt image, this body scheme, is so insistent, so ever-present, so convincing, that it can survive the loss of a limb. After an accident in which he lost his left leg, this young man was surprised to find that he could still feel the limb stuck in uncomfortable positions.
Well, I could be lying flat on a bed and it'll be pointing through the bed. It's a bit unnerving at times. But, and sometimes I'll be walking along with it, I'll be standing up with it straight and it'll be bent behind me, because that's the position when I had the accident. And after that, I just had no feeling in it for a while. I generally have to put the artificial leg on. I just look where the artificial leg is, and my brain sort of communicates, and it goes back to where it should be. It just feels like it's there, but there's no sense of touch.
I can stand here while talking to you and twiddle my toes around. They're moving at the moment. I can virtually feel them now. Though I know the leg is not there, I can still feel the foot moving. But as the doctors say, this is what they call the phantom pains, which will exist for quite some time. I can feel the same symptoms, same pains now with the leg off that I felt with the leg on.
After losing his right arm less than 2 weeks ago, Tom McCarthy is already haunted by an invisible limb of enormous proportions.
About a 9-inch stump. I move it in every position, but my fist is just tucked underneath, just like that. I can't move it. But the fingers I can't separate. And my fist is clenched. I try all the time, just can't do it. It feels like something else, someone else's. It doesn't feel as if it's mine. Because it feels as if it's huge. And I'm just massive.
Strangely, the phantom does not have the proportions of the original limb.
The hand just feels all massive, really big. And I just can't move it. It's just stuck in one position. I feel as if it's there for the rest of my life.
Well, as time goes on, this phantom limb tends to dwindle and wither, to alter and fade. But it does so in rather peculiar ways. For instance, the arm part of the phantom may vanish, leaving a rather maddening piece of hand waggling invisibly from the edge of the real shoulder. Well, these phantom limbs are a painful ordeal, and surgeons are often frustrated in their attempt to abolish it. Well, it used to be thought that the sensation, the spurious sensation, arose from the irritable ends of the wounded nerve, and surgeons used to cauterize these, but usually to no avail. In fact, you can trace or chase the source of the phantom all the way into the central nervous system, and it still persists. It's almost as if it's as if the brain had somehow rehearsed the image of the limb so well that it insists on preserving the impression of something that's no longer there. Now, this situation can be reversed. You can lose the image of a perfectly normal limb. You see, if the felt image is impaired for any reason, that's to say, if it's halved or lost as a result of injury or surgery, It's then very hard to recognize or even make sense of one's own visual appearance. And this is what happens with certain rather rare forms of brain damage. If the nervous framework of the felt image is wiped out or injured, the patient somehow withdraws recognition from the affected side of his own body. He seems to lose one half of his immediate self. As a result, he finds it rather hard to locate sensations on that side. And although he may feel the examiner's hand touching him, he very frequently refers the sensation to the opposite side. It also affects his ability to make voluntary movements on that side, although the limb isn't necessarily paralyzed. Now, you can show this by a rather nice experiment. If you throw such a patient a pair of gloves and ask him to put them both on, he will glove one hand and leave the other one bare. And yet he had to use the other one in order to glove this, so he couldn't have been paralyzed. Now, the fact that he could see the ungloved hand doesn't seem to help him very much. And when you think about it, there's really no reason why it should. You see, he can no longer reconcile what he sees with what he feels. That ungloved object over there may look like a hand, certainly, but since there's no felt image corresponding to it, why on earth should he claim this unowned object as his? Of course, he's puzzled by the fact that this orphan limb is somehow attached to him, but the loss of the felt image on that side overwhelms that consideration. And the patient may even resort to rather elaborate fictions in order to explain the anomaly. He may insist, for example, that the nurses have stuck someone else's arm on while he wasn't looking. He may even ask them to take it away with his breakfast tray. A few days ago, this patient suffered a small stroke in the part of the brain which is responsible for feelings on the left side of the body, so that he now finds it very hard to make sense of his own appearance.
And I saw this hand down there, so I reached down and grabbed it, and I was hoping. What? That's your hand. Mine large and was very stiff and was heavy. Felt like my hand felt like it weighed about 10 pounds, the hand itself.
At that time, who did you think the hand might have belonged to?
Some other body, not mine. I can't describe this numb feeling in my hand right now, my arm. I can't hold my arm like yours did now. It'll start to crawl and suddenly will drop down, even now.
It feels weaker than usual.
It is weak, yes. Absolutely weak.
But when you saw this funny hand that wasn't yours but was a hand, did you have any feeling about what it might be? Did you, if you felt it wasn't yours and yet there was a hand in the room with you, who did you think it belonged to?
Well, the only feeling that I had was that I knew it was a hand, but whose hand I didn't know. I know it didn't have any business down on my leg, and I was going to get rid of it. I was pulling my own hand, but didn't know it. And my wife said, "That's your hand." So I had two hands here, but I still didn't feel like my hand. There's no feeling in it, just like a lifeless hand.
I tell you what, close your eyes for a moment. Tell me where I touch you.
My right hand. Left. Right hand. Again. Again, right hand. Right hand. Left hand. Right hand, I believe I'm part of both. Light on the left hand and on the right hand, heavy.
Right, thank you very much indeed. You see, there is some neglect of this side of the body. As you can see, he feels a touch on that side, he feels a touch on that side. But when I touch both sides, this intact side takes precedence over that, so that even though he can recognize both singly, when they are touched together simultaneously, this side is somehow more vividly possessed by him than this side is. this is somehow still almost a protectorate territory. It's not fully part of his metropolitan self. Mr. Scott has evacuated himself to some extent from this side of his body. He no longer occupies it with all the vigor that he occupies and owns this side of his body. Now, very often, when someone has this sort of condition in their body, it also implies the same sort of condition by analogy in the world. In other words, the patient often projects the same sort of failure of recognition into that half of the world. And the most vivid examples of this are seen with symmetrical objects. The patient may be able to tell the time between 12 and 6, and yet may be completely indifferent to the hours from 6 to 12. Mrs. Wilkins has a normal brain and 2 normal legs. However, a broken neck has severed the nervous connection between limb and brain, and the only link between the two is her image in the mirror.
It just assures me that I'm in the right position as far as the rest of the world is concerned.
Right with regard to what?
The way my feet should be lined up, that they're not over there or shorter than I think they are or distorted in some way. I mean, I'm sure you've seen people who are all kind of crunched up and poorly positioned and can't straighten out. And that's the kind of image I get of myself. That I guess that probably it does. It changes my whole image of my body until I check and find the body image to be what I know it is rather than what I feel it is. I would feel that my legs were very distorted or that my posture was very distorted or that I looked very peculiar. Just to be told it wasn't the way I thought it was wouldn't be enough. I would really have to see myself in the mirror or looking down. But looking down is a distortion too. So just sitting in the chair and looking isn't really enough. You have to get the visual feedback from the total. If my foot were in actuality hanging off the side of the chair, I wouldn't know it. Because realistically, I don't have any sensation in my legs. I've been operated on without anesthetic, and I don't have any sensation. And yet I don't feel that I don't have any sensation. I feel I have these distorted perceptions of it, distorted sensation.
But very occasionally, the patient appears to lose the whole image of themselves. And when that happens, it's almost impossible for them to identify any sensations as belonging to them. There's a wonderful example of this in Charles Dickens' Hard Times, when Mrs. Gradgrind lies dying.
Have you a pain, Mother? There's a pain somewhere in the room, but I cannot be certain that I have got it.
Now, perhaps I can put this a little bit more clearly. Look, if you have a ring on your hand, and your hand is resting on the table, it makes perfectly good sense to say that my ring is resting on the table as well. But if I have a pain in my hand, it sounds very odd to say that my pain is resting on the table. Although, to be strictly fair, it also sounds odd, or would sound odd, to say that my rash or my pimple was resting on the table. But it sounds much odder to talk about a pain in this way. Well, the point is that pains don't really happen in hands or feet or heads, or anywhere physical for that matter. If pains happen at all, they happen in the images of heads and feet and hands. And if that image is missing for any reason, then the sensations are more or less homeless. In fact, the reason why we talk so glibly of having pains in our heads or in our feet or in our hands is simply that under normal circumstances, the subjective image of these parts coincides with their physical existence. In fact, the felt image of the physical self is really something in the nature of a fiction. That's to say, it's an imaginary space, a translucent volume, which is usually occupied by the body of which it's supposed to be an imitation or a copy. It's rather like a jelly mold. But this mold or image or volume or fiction is not something that we're born with. In fact, this image is laboriously constructed as we grow up and gain control over our physical movements. It's painfully brought into existence as a result of the sensations which we achieve and get back as we move our own limbs. As we learn to reach and grope, then we learn to distinguish ourselves from the world in which we live. If an infant could speak, perhaps, all it might say is that there is a feeling somewhere, an infant Gradgrind, in fact. This image is strengthened and maintained throughout adult life by sensations which result from the skillful exercise of our own muscles and from the feelings which come back to us in the course of active exertion. By handling objects and overcoming their resistance, we recognize not only them, but our own shape, our own size and weight. By acting in and upon the world, we remodel our own image within it. Well, where is this image housed? Where is the fiction, the mold, the volume actually created? Well, the fact that it vanishes when the brain is injured proves that it must have a foundation in the nervous system. In the cases I mentioned first of all, they show that it must be somewhere in the higher reaches of the nervous system. For instance, patients who are unfortunate enough to suffer a stroke in addition to an amputation often find that the phantom vanishes at the same moment as the stroke. Well, the fact is that in a sense we all of us have phantom limbs. But in our case, the phantom, the translucent volume, the jelly mold, coincides with an actual limb which fills it up. It's almost as if we slip ourselves into a translucent glove of the possibility of self. In the late 1950s, neurosurgeons like Wilder Penfield in Canada discovered a way of locating and drawing the outlines of this image in the living brain. Using local anesthetics, they found that it was possible to open the skull of conscious patients, which gave them an unprecedented opportunity for hearing the body image, as it were, speak for itself. Now, these investigations were not done out of gratuitous curiosity, since they were carried out during essential surgery. By stimulating the exposed surface of the brain point by point, Penfield and his colleagues found that although there was no local sensation in the brain itself, the conscious patient invariably reported peculiar feelings in remote parts of the body. And very slowly, they were able to map a consistent image of the body. Now, the point is that this map is not drawn to scale. Its proportions are not the same as those of the physique which it represents. Certain parts seem to get more than their fair share of representation. The face, and especially the mouth, are represented over a much wider area of brain than the leg is. The representation of the hand and the thumb is vastly out of proportion to their anatomical size. In fact, if you think of this rather crude image as a map of the body, you'd have to regard it as an electoral map of the country, where the size of each region is related not so much to its geographical spread, but to the number of parliamentary constituencies which it has. Now, on an ordinary scale map of Great Britain, of course Scotland would appear larger than the south of England. But if we draw a map in which each parliamentary constituency has a square inch all to itself, then the size of Scotland shrinks, and the south of England, which sends a large number of members to Parliament, appears quite vast by comparison. Well, this is more or less what happens in the brain map. Because of their enormous functional importance, the mouth and the hands have many more points representing them than the leg or the trunk have. And that's what accounts for the strange anamorphic experience of the image which we feel. It's also what accounts for that large hole which you feel in your tooth with the tip of your tongue. It's not that the hole is particularly large, but because the parliamentary lobby of the tongue which feels the hole is enormous. And since the hand also has a disproportionately large representation in the brain, fevers can affect the way it feels.
You feel it as your hands are 10 times larger than they are. They're not really bigger in the sense that they just grow to a large size, but they just go fat. It's like your hands blowing up like a balloon.
How far up the arm does the feeling go?
Just as far as here. And you put your hands together, and you still feel it, and you play tricks with your hands, move your fingers about, and you still feel your hands great big fat like a balloon, as if they're blown up like a balloon. My hands are normal weight. They're just very, very fat and big. They look small, but the feeling goes to your brain, and you look at them, and you can see them as small, but your brain says they're large.
All right, then. How are these parliamentary representatives in the brain actually linked up to the constituencies which they represent? Well, the electoral map is not simply a picture of the body. It's really it's a neurological projection of it. And the reason why we feel pain in the appropriate part of our self-image is because there's a nervous landline between the sense organs in the skin and the muscles and the parliamentary representative which answers for it. Once they enter the central nervous system, these fibers run parallel to ones which are coming from other areas of the body. But as they travel upwards towards the head, the fibers are grouped according to their source. The fibers which are coming from the leg are found in the middle part of the spinal cord, whereas those from the arm and head are found on the outer side of the cord. Now, at the top of what's called the brain stem, all the sensory fibers from one side of the body have been tightly bunched into one cable, rather like this bundle of glass fibers. But as you can see from the lights, the fibers are not arranged higgledy-piggledy, but still preserve a map-like pattern of the light source from which the fibers come. In fact, you can trace all the red fibers right back to the red light in the box, and the same with the green fibers, so that even if I was to fan the fibers out like that, the spatial relationships of the original pattern back in the light box would still be preserved, although, of course, it would be splayed out. Well, it's the same thing with the brain. The bundles of nerves fan out and project onto the wrinkled surface of the brain, producing the map which we evoked at the operation. Now, it becomes obvious when you study this map that certain important parts of the body are conspicuous by their absence. Where's the heart represented, for instance? The liver and the kidneys and so forth? Well, in electoral terms, it's as if a large part of the working population had no parliamentary representation at all, no member to speak up for them. And that's what accounts for the fact that we have no felt image of the normal heart, or the normal liver, or the normal pancreas. In fact, the conscious relationship we have to our own internal organs is rather like the one which the brain-damaged patients had to their own limbs. You may know that you have a heart, you've certainly been told that you have a liver, but there's no subjective image corresponding to any of these organs. And yet, patients with disease in the heart certainly feel pain. And as anyone knows who's ever had a stone in the kidney, there certainly is such a thing as pain from the kidney. But these patients don't feel pain in the heart or in the kidney, because there's no such place for them to have a pain in. All such pains are, as we say, referred. That's to say, they're felt in a part for which there already is a felt image. And for each particular organ, the pain is always felt in the same place. For example, the pain of coronary heart disease is usually felt across the front of the chest, in the shoulders, sometimes in the arms. It may go down the left arm and even be in the little finger, for example. It's often felt in the neck or the jaw. Where it's not felt is where the heart actually is, that's to say, slightly over to the left. In fact, when patients start to complain about pain on the left-hand side of their chest, you can be fairly certain that they're not complaining about disease of the heart. They're simply obsessed about the fact that they might have illness in the heart. The reason for this referred pain is that the heart changes its position during the development of the fetus. The heart starts its life in the lower part of the neck and travels down into the chest and lands up resting on the diaphragm. Well, during its journey, it retains its nervous connection with the neck. And since this region is also responsible for the development of the arm, the pain of a heart attack is nostalgically felt on behalf of the heart by its long-lost embryological partner. Although these sensations are referred or slanted away from the place where the mischief itself is, they are at least located somewhere. That's to say, they have a distinct and often very characteristic site, even if it is misleading, at least as far as the patient is concerned. In fact, we'd find it almost impossible to understand someone who claimed to have a pain but was unable to say where it was, like Mrs. Gradgrind, for example. Of course, some pains are more sharply located than others, pricks, stabs and shoots, for instance, whereas those ones which we call aches tend to have a hazy, voluminous feeling without any sharp outline. All the same, even the vaguest pain can be pointed to, even if you can only point to it vaguely. I mean, you may have to use your whole hand rather than the tip of your finger. But when it comes to sensations like nausea, for example, then the idea of place seems much less important. In fact, it's actually very hard to say where nausea is. Admittedly, you don't have nausea in the legs, say, and you don't have it in the arms or in the head, but then you don't necessarily feel it in what's left over after you've subtracted all these parts. In fact, if you ask people where they feel nausea, it's very hard to get any agreement.
Well, it's a feeling really I can't describe.
And where exactly? Would you point to it?
In the stomach.
Exactly where? You point to it. Where do you felt it?
Oh, there.
Down here?
And what do you feel down there?
Horrible.
When you feel nauseous, where do you feel it?
I think you only feel it here, you see. So there's a lump about there.
Right in the middle of the chest.
Well, it gets to the brain sort of thing.
Oh, in the throat and the stomach, I suppose.
In the back of the throat here.
In the head.
What do you feel in your head when you feel...
Very tired.
Well, it's just the sort of squeezing, you know, everything's sort of tightening and then you know you're going to be sick.
Oh, across the chest and the head swells up and... Oh, terrible. Really terrible.
And what is it that you feel across the chest?
Pain.
No, it's not a pain. It's like something like inside you, like, you know, just
sickly feeling, but...
Well, now, where do you have a sickly feeling? When you feel sick?
When I get a pain just about here.
There's no pain whatsoever. Slight pain in your head and you just feel sick.
No, it's not pain. It's just a funny feeling.
What's the feeling itself like?
That's very hard to explain. That's very hard to explain.
Well, this problem of location becomes even more puzzling with experiences like hunger, say, or thirst, so-called cravings. Now, it's very hard to say where cravings are located, where you have them. Now, I know that thirsty people often complain about having a dry mouth, but if that was all there was to it, then the feeling of thirst ought to be wiped out at the first mouthful of water, as soon as the mouth is moistened. Now, if you lead the food pipe of an animal out through its neck and make it thirsty, it'll go on gulping water incessantly for 24 hours. It never relieves its thirst. So, dry mouth is obviously a relatively trivial part of the experience of thirst. Well, the same principle applies to hunger. Although there are abdominal pangs associated with extreme hunger, you can still feel hunger without these pangs. And it's not really a question of having fevered visions of extravagant feasts either. After all, you can have visions, fevered or otherwise, of extravagant feasts without craving for them, without ever being hungry. So, what do you crave food with? What tells you that you're craving? Well, in fact, we now know that thirst and hunger are the result of changes in the chemistry of the bloodstream, and that these alterations are registered by sense organs in the brain. That doesn't mean that one feels hunger or thirst in the brain. One doesn't have a brain ache as a result of hunger. One simply is hungry or is thirsty, and that's that. Although sensations like these are so vague that one's reluctant to call them sensations at all, although they have no particular place within the body, it's only within the body that they happen. The body image, then, encloses and includes all the experiences that flesh is heir to. But the body image is also rather like an amoeba. It can change shape, and it can even reach out and include inanimate objects in the outside world. Once this man got used to his armor, once he learned to move it with the same fluency that he moved his limbs, his body image enlarged so that he felt the pleated metal as an integral part of himself. And the same goes for the horse that he's riding. Because the steed obeys each touch of the spur and the bit, the rider feels that he's extended himself into the limbs of his mount, and like a centaur, rider and animal fuse into a single image. All this is a question of voluntary control. Whenever we can move something at will, we begin to find that our body image extends mysteriously into its outlines. In fact, almost anyone who's learned to drive a car knows this feeling intuitively. I remember when I was first learning to park this vehicle, I had to hang halfway out of the window in order to see how my rear was doing. And since my attempts usually failed miserably, I had to recruit innocent bystanders to act as invigilators. But once I became familiar with the controls, once its movements became part of my second nature, then it was almost as if I felt my own image extending into the four corners of the vehicle. So much so that if I happened to scrape against the vehicle that was parked behind, I could almost feel the impact in my own body. But let's get back to pain for a moment. After all, it plays the largest part in the clinical history of illness. Of all the unlikable feelings one can have, pain perhaps isn't the worst. I suppose nausea or unremitting ringing in the ears are pretty bad. In fact, they can drive patients to the ends of their tether. But all the same, pain probably plays the major part in our fear of illness. Well, what sort of sensation is it then? What sort of quality does it have? What causes it? Well, strangely enough, it's almost impossible to identify any one particular stimulus which can cause pain. The feeling of pain tends to be associated with injury, of course, which is what accounts for our fear of injury. And yet, if that was all there was to it, there'd be a straightforward relationship between the severity of the injury and the intensity of the pain. In this procedure, however, the prospect of injury is negligible, and yet the pain is often extreme. And the same disproportion holds for other situations, but in reverse. This remarkable piece of film was shot during an actual raid over Germany, during which the possibility of massive injury was ever present. But when the possibility was realized, as it so often was, Air Force doctors were surprised by how little pain was reported at the time of injury, during moments like this.
There's 4 of them, 1 o'clock high.
They're coming around. Watch.
Watch that fighter coming in at 3 o'clock.
He's coming in a half roll. Pull her up, Chief. Pull her up. Hurry. There's 2 more diving through the 94th.
3 planes, 9 o'clock, coming around. Keep your eye on them, boys. Breaking at 11.
I got him. He's coming around underneath at 10 o'clock. I see him. 2 at 2 o'clock.
Watch him, Scotty.
I got my sights on him.
Check that B-17, Chuck. 3 o'clock. Loader smoking. Fighter at 10:30, coming around.
Those 10:30 upper or lower? son of a bitch. I got him. Confirm that fighter. He got him, Chief. Look, he's bailing out.
And yet when all that activity, heroism and excitement had subsided, when the injured men were returned to base, the intensity of the pain slowly began to mirror the severity of their injuries. It's as if pain is an opinion rather than a sensation. And it seems that this opinion can be changed by all the other experiences which the sufferer is having at the same time, and especially by how much he expects his own activity to affect the outcome. There's simply nothing to do in a dentist's waiting room, and once you do get into the surgery, you play a purely passive role. Even today, physiologists find it very hard to explain the unpredictable variety of painful experience. Modern scientists have tried to account for it in terms of the various switches and gates which control the traffic of information inside the brain and spinal cord. And although these explanations are not altogether successful, we can get some hint of what the scientists are driving at by drawing an analogy with the traffic of information through a newspaper. A newspaper, then, is a pyramid of responsibility. Far-flung reporters phone in their stories, unaware of the events which are being reported by their colleagues. These stories don't begin to compete for the front page until they reach the editorial headquarters. And once they've arrived there, only a few are considered by the editor himself, since sub-editors have already assessed the relative interest and importance of the input. At the very top level, the editor and his assistants survey this preliminary choice. The front page, then, is rather like consciousness, and its format reflects the editorial policy of the nervous system. In a normal edition, there may be one main story and several others on the same front page, but if some new story monopolizes the editor's attention, the whole format will change. Stories which were felt to be important for the previous edition may be pushed to the inside pages.
Okay, fire.
Yeah, that's the Buckler story.
That's good in the mornings about that. Can we just go over once again what we're getting here? I think taking all this together, it makes a very good story.
Right, okay. Boy!
The presses will have to be stopped, the columns and the headlines reset, all in response to a new item of special interest, and this can happen as much as 5 times a day. In the nervous system, though, consciousness is being re-edited thousands of times a second, and our presses keep running.
Great.
And the format changes its appearance from moment to moment.
That's gone.
That's all inside.
That's all inside. So we're starting absolutely from scratch.
Yep.
As with a newspaper, consciousness is not simply a picture of the world it represents. It's an editorial comment upon it. And even urgent experiences like pain may vanish from the headlines.
Conrad's all going on 6, yes?
And other incoming messages take precedence. Excitement, heroism, and pride all help to reshape our feelings.
Hello, F-slug, D4. Yeah, on there. F-slug, phase 6. F-slug, phase 6. F-slug, phase 6.
The reason why those airmen felt as little pain as they did was because they were actively involved in defending themselves, whereas the dental patient had nothing to do but concentrate on the pain. And I sometimes think that this may help to explain the horror of torture. When a prisoner enters a torture chamber, he knows that pain is the sole purpose of his visit. He's usually been reminded of the fact from the very moment of his arrest. He is there to suffer. Just like in Kafka's great story of the penal colony, his physique exists for the sole purpose of having pain inscribed upon it. Everything is arranged in order to reduce the role of his own actions. He's trussed, he's immobilized. And by these means, the threshold of pain, which is fickle at the best of times, is lowered to the lowest possible level. And what's more, he's usually isolated, and any possibility of heroism is removed by his being repeatedly told that no one will ever know his fate or how he reacted. Pain, then, like pleasure, has a social use as well as a biological function. Although it was originally evolved to ensure our survival in a dangerous world, it puts us at the disposal of those who wish to influence our conduct. Because this felt self, this private phantom, is housed in a public body, our personal life is always at risk from those who wish to control its social use.